Tommy Hilfiger, for decades now, has been one of the world's most well-known fashion designers. We can instantly recognize his brand from that red, white, and blue nautical flag logo. For the longest time, and this might be the case for you, I've always thought of them as one of those 90s brands. Early in that decade, they were known for their preppy clothing, collared shirts and sweaters and khakis. But then, by the end of that decade, surprisingly, they had attracted a more urban hip-hop crowd, and that clothing would better be described as streetwear. They would wear everything way oversized, with all of these really large and obvious logos on them. Looking back on it today, I have to say, it all still looks really cool, but in a more ridiculous sort of way. The reason you might consider them to be a 90s brand is because almost as soon as the 90s ended, people stopped wearing them, they weren't considered to be cool anymore, and as a result, their sales started to fall. Here's what I mean. All through the 90s, they were growing at an unbelievable rate. In less than a decade, they had grown 20 times larger, from 100 million in sales to just under 2 billion. Well, that 2 billion stands out as a high point because in the years following, they held somewhat steady but with an obvious gradual decline. However, it is not that straightforward. If you happen to be from Europe watching this, you may be really confused right now because those lower, later years represented are probably when you first heard of them. Tommy Hilfiger started selling clothes in Europe in 1997, but it wasn't significant enough to even report separately until 2002. That year, they accounted for a tenth of their total sales. 3 years later, it was a third of their sales, and by 2009, it was over half, making that the primary part of their business. So here, when you only see a slight decline in their total sales, remember, it's sort of averaging out because their success in Europe is making up for their failure in the US. But then, if I extend this graph through 2019, we can see that they have made a really impressive comeback. Tommy Hilfiger sales have continued to grow in Europe, they've reversed the trend in the US, and have grown in other parts of the world as well. All of that totaling to almost $5 billion in sales. So, I want to provide reasons behind this graph and talk about the rise, fall, and rise again of Tommy Hilfiger. And I have to say, there is a lot to respect about this guy. Despite having no formal training in fashion design, for decades now, he's been one of the biggest names in fashion. He is from a town called Elmira. It's in upstate New York, about a 4-hour drive from the city. His first exposure to the fashion industry was when he was a teenager. He would take that 4-hour drive to buy some jeans from the city, haul them back, and sell them out of his car in his hometown. By the time he was 18 years old, that business had evolved into an actual retail store called People's Place, and most of the stuff that they sold there was inspired by fashions and music. This was 1969, when the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix were big, so it ended up being a lot of this colorful, hippie type of clothing. And this is important, he would actually design some of it. The fact that he owned his own retail store gave him the rare opportunity to learn how to design clothing. People's Place did grow to a chain of 7 locations before ultimately closing down and filing for bankruptcy in 1977. The reasons for it aren't completely clear, but I would assume that being young and inexperienced combined with a poor local economy had something to do with it. From there, he continued designing clothes both on his own and for other companies until 1985 when he teamed up with a man named Mohan Mirjani to start the famous Tommy Hilfiger brand that we all know today. See, Mirjani was already a successful clothing manufacturer, famously known for making Gloria Vanderbilt jeans. They were very popular, they had her name stitched into the pocket, one of the first to do it, so when he wanted to make a line of Tommy Hilfiger clothing, it was a big opportunity. I think this is great. For the launch of the brand in the fall of 1985, their primary way to tell people about it was this giant billboard right in the center of Manhattan. And this has to be the most amazingly confident billboard that I have ever seen. It said, "The 4 great American designers for men are," and then it turns into a fill in the blank, where the first 3 answers are obviously Ralph Lauren, Perry Ellis, and Calvin Klein. The 4th name on the list was implied to be Tommy Hilfiger. It had the logo and said that he was the least known of the 4, but think about what it was doing. Remember, this was for the launch of the brand. He hadn't proven himself, he did not deserve to be on that list. He was simply telling people how great he was without proving it in any way. That billboard didn't even have any examples of his designs. Well, thousands of people saw it, the late night hosts were talking about it, and because so much of fashion is about perception of the brand, many people started believing that Tommy Hilfiger was indeed one of the great American designers. It really did prove to be a clever, outside-the-box way of establishing his name. After 3 years, he separated from Merjani when he got together with some investors to buy the brand from him and establish a new company that was named after himself. In 1992, that company had an initial public stock offering, and that's when they quickly became one of the biggest fashion brands in the country. As I said before, they started the decade by focusing on that preppy look, which proved to be the perfect timing because casual Fridays were becoming common in offices across the country, so the market for clothes like that was suddenly growing. And then came the hip-hop community. I don't believe that this was the start of it, but a big jump for that demographic was in 1994 when Snoop Dogg performed a song on Saturday Night Live wearing one of their shirts where the name Tommy could not have been more prominent. From there, it just naturally started becoming part of the urban community, so then Tommy Hilfiger embraced it by making them in giant sizes and making the logos bigger and bigger. Really, it's just such a weird transition, but by the end of the decade, it seemed like all of the biggest musicians were wearing it. I am talking about Michael Jackson and Britney Spears. Here is a photo of Destiny's Child dressed entirely in the brand, posing with Tommy Hilfiger himself. I need to pause this and say that this is an extremely 90s picture, and actually, that sort of became part of their issue. I think that all of us would agree that these oversized, colorful clothes that had become the image of the brand have since fallen out of fashion. It was a trend, and in the words of Tommy Hilfiger, we made the mistake of following a trend that was going to be short-lived, because any trend is short-lived. In addition to that, the brand simply became too common and started to lose that premium, exclusive image. Also, in the words of Tommy Hilfiger, the large logos and the big red, white, and blue theme became ubiquitous. It got to a point where the urban kids didn't want to wear it, and the preppy kids didn't want to wear it. So the perception fell, sales went down, and then they weren't able to sell it at that higher premium price anymore. Knowing that, the Tommy Hilfiger company decided to lower the quality so that they can afford to sell it at lower prices, which just made the brand appear cheaper and cheaper. It really is strange, but what started out as a higher-end preppy brand was turning into lower-end streetwear. We can see how things were snowballing in a bad way, and it took some strategic moves to bring everything back. So here's what they did. Remember, they were doing better than ever in Europe, so it would probably be a good idea to look at what they're doing and try to imitate it back in the US. Well, it turned out that what they were doing over there was extremely similar to what they started doing in the US. At higher prices, higher quality, less exposure, and as a result, a more positive, stronger brand image overall. But in order to imitate that, to bring Tommy Hilfiger back to basics, back to what is proven to work, it was going to take some time. It would obviously require some major changes, where they may not see any benefits from it until years down the line. Investors in public companies are famously, and maybe understandably, not willing to stick with a company for years while they figure things out, so to execute it, they needed to return to a private company for the first time in 14 years. Well, in 2006, they executed a perfect plan, where the management found a private equity firm willing to buy them for $1.6 billion and give them the freedom to make these changes. The manager leading that buyout was Fred Gehring, who was previously the head of the European division and became their new CEO. That's when they raised their quality, raised their prices, and started designing smaller, somewhat more subtle clothing. In an effort to better control the quality, they made a deal with Macy's where they would be the only other retailer that could sell the clothing. And then they opened this large 22,000 square foot flagship store in Manhattan that was meant to function as a giant advertisement for the renovated brand. They did all of this, by the way, while continuing to grow their European presence at an even faster rate. Like they had expected, their overall sales took a little time to recover, but by 2009, their $2.2 billion in sales was more than they had ever had before, which, as I said in the beginning, was their first year their European sales surpassed the ones in the US. Then, in 2010, the brand was sold once again, this time to Philips Van Heusen for the price of $3 billion. When you compare that to the $1.6 billion that they paid for it in 2006, it means that the brand had almost doubled in value in less than 4 years. By the way, the company who bought it, Philips Van Heusen, they own a bunch of other fashion brands that you may recognize, such as, well, Van Heusen, Izod, and Calvin Klein. I think it is really interesting to mention that one because back in 1985, Tommy Hilfiger put his own name on a billboard right under Calvin Klein when he had no business being there. And now, decades later, they coincidentally are part of the same company where Tommy Hilfiger repeatedly outsells Calvin Klein. on. That is an incredibly inspirational thought. Right now, I encourage everyone that aspires to do something to write your own name on a list alongside some of the leaders in that field. Now, ideally, you would publish that on a giant billboard in the middle of a big city, but I suppose it also works if you just kind of hold on to it for the next few years and then look back at the list and see where you stand. That is pretty much what Tommy Hilfiger did. Honestly, it may be hard to actually beat his results, but I still think it's a cool exercise. Alright, to summarize, Tommy Hilfiger is back. They fell into the trap of following trends and overexposing themselves. It was reckless, it was short-sighted, and they found themselves in need of some changes to repair the brand that they had let slip. New owners and new managers took over to execute a plan to improve their image and to bring them back to popularity. Soon after they were able to make that turn, a new set of owners took over who were in the position to further grow the brand to a ridiculously new height. This figure of almost $5 billion in sales proves that many people around the world once again see Tommy Hilfiger as a cool designer brand. Let me know in the comments, what do you think of Tommy Hilfiger, and how has your perception changed over the years? And when I ask that, I guess I'm asking about the brand and the person, but either way, you have to respect what they've accomplished. Not only building one of the most popular fashion brands, but actually being able to fix some of their mistakes and bring it back into popularity. So any thoughts about Tommy Hilfiger or this rise and fall and rise again, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.